Hey everyone, we are live again tonight discussing chapters 10 and 11 of Saints. Tonight with us, we have a special guest. And before we get to introduce Nick, I would like to know, where is everybody watching from? Let us know in the comments below so we can know where you're watching from. But also, if you have any comments on the broadcast at all, any questions, the plan is to make this a live online book chat, specifically over chapters 10 and 11. So with us today, again, we have Nick Galetti. Nick, you are live.
Hello.
Hey, give us a little bit of background. You've done some great things and are doing some great things. Let us know what you're doing.
Well, thank you. Yeah, as you might tell from my overly produced microphone setup, that I do podcasting, and I currently do podcasting for Book of Mormon Central, and we actually are just about to hit our 500th podcast episode, which is just insane to think that we've been doing it that long. I also am the host for the Latter-day Saint Mission Cast, which is a missionary-centric podcast with great interviews that are good for those preparing or coming home from a mission. And I've done podcasting for other LDS things in the past, but that seems to be my biggest focus right now in my public life, if you will, is doing podcasting. And I love church history. I've published a couple of books, published a couple of documentaries on early Latter-day Saint history, and so I've kind of dabbled in a lot of different things. I've got a jack of all trades kind of a set of criteria on how I've moved forward. And I wouldn't say I'm a master of much in that sense, but I definitely have kept busy learning all I can about the gospel and about the church's history. It's been a fantastic opportunity to read the saints and to comment and be a part of this live broadcast is awesome. I'm excited to dig into chapters 10 and 11 tonight.
Yeah, this will be fun. Thanks for joining us. And we will begin then, if that's okay. We'll jump right into this.
Yeah.
I'm going to cover chapter 10, and we'll talk about some fun things that happened within chapter 10. The first thing that as chapter 10 opens, we have Oliver Cowdery, Parley P. Pratt, and Ziba Peterson. Basically, they find the Morley farm, but they find the Morley farm because Lucy, their daughter, is doing something. And tell us a little bit about that. Do you remember much about that, Nick? What was happening when Lucy, the daughter, was first introduced to these three missionaries?
If I remember correctly, it wasn't. They were looming. They were creating different, I guess, rugs, garments. I would assume rugs, and she was interested to be welcoming to the missionaries, but or no, maybe it was Abigail that was welcoming, but there wasn't exactly a warm reception
Exactly.
to what was going on, and she kind of decided to send them down the road in a matter of speaking, because she wasn't too keen on what they were saying. I'm looking for the quote.
Yeah.
Oh, right here. I don't want any of your damnable doctrine taught in my house.
Yes. You cannot have anything to eat in my house, Abigail Daniels.
Yeah.
I do not feed imposters, is what she said.
Oh, so, such a beautiful rebuke in a way.
Now, yeah, that's interesting, isn't it? Now, later, though, she was converted to the church. So
absolutely.
It's a 180 there a little bit later. But Lucy Morley, the daughter who was at Abigail Daniels' farm kind of helping and assisting, she said, hey, my parents never turn anyone away. And maybe talk about that, the Morley farm, just the way that they were set up, everything was in common. Do you have anything you want to say there?
Well, we're definitely going to be able to talk more about some of how that plays into chapter 11 a little bit later on, but it was a very communal kind of idea, and not exactly the same as what you might find in what we call the law of consecration or the United Order, but similar enough that it's easy for those two things to get confused. It was essentially a situation where they were trying to live in some sort of cooperative, and therefore there wasn't as much speaking about ownership and who owned what, but it was about working together and having all things in common.
Absolutely. So absolutely.
It wasn't what you might find a lot in America at that time.
Correct, correct. And on the screen now, I'm showing the Isaac Morley farm where it exists, just outside Kirtland, Ohio.
It's
Again, not
gorgeous.
right in town, but it's got a pretty broad stretch of land there that they drew from. And here's the house a little bit closer up. But again, as Lucy Morley, the daughter, promised, the three missionaries found a hearty meal at the Morley farm. Her parents, who were Isaac and Lucy, they were members of Sidney Rigdon's congregation. So again, here's an early Sidney, picture of early Sidney. And again, a very key figure in the church that was converted. And we'll talk more about all these people in the Kirtland area. So, so they were shown to the Morley farm. They obviously went there, and over the next few days, they preached, and the number of converts was pretty amazing. And as it mentions here on the scrolling crawler, many people were converted. Most of them were living on the Morley's farms. And interestingly enough, it notates that Pete, a freed slave whose mother had come from West Africa, was one of the converts. So again, you know, we talk about Jane Manning James and other early individuals in the church that were black or of color. Here's Pete, who was one of the early converts. So very, very interesting.
Yeah.
One other thing that I'd love to cover in this chapter is, obviously we have Sidney here, and he had a friend, Edward Partridge, which I'll pull up Edward. Oh, I've got him in the next chapter. Sorry.
Yeah.
So Edward Partridge was one of his friends, a 37-year-old hat maker from his congregation, was also doing things with Sidney. And Sidney said, hey, you should come on down and meet the Smiths. And of course, Edward had some interest in doing that. Sidney was baptized, but Edward was not. He wanted to look over, as he went down to the Kirtland area, though, to the New York area, he was looking for Joseph. And one of the things that really helped impact him was he wanted to look at their property. He wanted to look at their handiwork, because he felt that their handiwork might reveal something about their character.
Right.
What are your thoughts on that, Nick?
Well, you know, I guess you do whatever you can to get converts, right? If that's going to work, you know, let's give them the chance. So, yeah, I think they went up to Manchester, which was 300 miles from Kirtland, just to check things out. And he saw the Joseph's parents, who were, you know, or at least he tried to get to their home, found out they had moved. But eventually he gets to their place and finds that they had well-kept orchards. Their homes and outbuildings were all in good shape. They had stone walls that they constructed, and you know that essentially testified of family order and industry. And so he was rather impressed, and eventually he came back and said, the line in this chapter says, Edward stood and told the saints what he had seen and felt on his trip. Then he said, I'm ready to be baptized, Brother Joseph. Will you baptize me? And so, you know, again, whatever works. Who knows, right? If it could be, you know, we've heard stories of dignitaries and individuals coming through Salt Lake to see the granary and Welfare Square and see some of how they operate. And in doing so, people have seen that side of the church and have also been impressed and been open to the gospel message. So we just sometimes never know what's going to interest people, but it says an awful lot about Edward Partridge's character, and we'll learn certainly more of that in chapter 11.
Absolutely. That's great. Good thought. Now, interestingly enough, when he first heard Joseph and he went to the to a gathering one evening, he heard the words, he wanted to be baptized, and Joseph's response was, hey, let's wait until the morning, basically, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, though, and again, this is on the crawler that you're seeing across the screen, before the baptism took place for Edward, Joseph received a revelation pre-baptism, calling Edward to preach and prepare for the day when Christ would come to his temple. So he actually, right after he was baptized, basically went out to get his friends and family to join the church. So, yeah. Wow, talk about, you know, immediate, something just immediately happening. And this shows, I think, not only what Joseph thought of Edward and his character and the type of individual he was. But of course, the Lord knew who he was as well. And we'll find out more about that in chapter 11 as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I want to point out, by the way, we have someone from Papua New Guinea that has checked in.
Oh, great.
Pretty
Great.
incredible. I didn't know we had people coming from all the way there. That's great.
Actually, let's call out some of these comments. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. So we have Moses Stephen from Papua New Guinea, Lake Hills, Texas, Donna Forrest. We have Suzanne English Fry from Essex, England in the UK. We've got Mara Berry from Oregon. And we have a heart from William Mariner. So thanks, everyone. Make sure you go ahead and comment below with anything that you would like to say about these chapters. Again, we are talking about chapter 10 right now in Saints, and we will soon begin talking about chapter 11 as well. So the inspired translation of the Bible begins, and that's what this picture accompanying us represents. We know that as they started to look through the Bible, and when I say they, this was because Oliver was called to preach to the American Indians. We know that Sidney stepped in, as did Emma, to help with scribe duties somewhat. But as Sidney joined Joseph, we know that was one of his major duties. As they began the inspired translation of the Bible, they read some things. Again, this goes to the chapter 10 gathered in, title. The day would come, God told Enoch, when truth would be brought forth from the earth, and his people would build another city of Zion for the righteous. So we know that this was heavily on their mind, as were other things, right? When the priesthood was restored, specifically the Aaronic priesthood, they were reading about that and how would that happen, and they had questions. And as they went through all this, they had multiple questions. So again, this Zion-like people was one of the major themes here. I'd like to ask you a few questions. I'm going to go through a few more things here, though, Nick.
Yeah.
A commandment I give unto the church, Jesus declared that they should assemble together at the Ohio. How was that received? These were people in upstate New York that probably had generational ties to the area, that we know had a lot, I would say, a lot invested in the land, in their properties, and the things that they were doing. How was that received?
Well, it's a mixed bag, as you might expect, as some people were ready to go and others were a little bit more hesitant based on what was tying them to the area. There were those that were actually very concerned because they didn't have the money, the resources to travel. And one of the things, I believe it is section 38 of the Doctrine and Covenants, is where this initial call to go to Ohio was set forth. And it actually ties to the Enoch thing and building the city of Zion, because the concepts that were going to be revealed to the people that we'll discuss in chapter 11 had a lot to do with the eventual revelation on the law of consecration and having people come to a situation where it was less about what resources you had and what you were trying to build. So there was actually a lot of sacrifice. While there, again, were a few people that didn't immediately jump on board, a lot of people did. And there was a tremendous amount of sacrifice. A lot of people lost a lot of money selling their property. You can imagine a mass exodus creates a very large pool of land, but not a lot of people to buy it. So the demand curve kind of tilted against them, and to a point where, they weren't going to, they lost some money on that. But they knew, there's comments in the article and the chapter rather, that people understood that this was wisdom in the Lord, and they showed forth great faith. It was pretty impressive.
Yes. And you try to equate this to our day and what we might do, but one of the quotes from this chapter, and we know that this resides in Scripture as well. There I will give unto you my law, and there you shall be endowed with power from on high. And we know that he had great things in store, obviously with the Kirtland Temple and things that were planned there to give people the endowment and the covenants that were necessary to move forward. Closing out this chapter, because we're about halfway through, and I want to leave you at least 20 minutes for chapter 11 to
All
talk
right.
about that. Let's talk about Newell and Ann Whitney.
Okay.
A great, I would say, a great young couple, relatively young. We would think that lived in Ohio, and here I am imposing basically a comic book, I think, from the New Era or The Friend, which talks about this encounter, the first encounter that Newell and Anne had with Joseph and Emma. But basically, we know that there was some urgency for Joseph to get to Ohio because of some of the things that were happening there, some of the ways that spiritual manifestations were supposedly being rendered. He wanted to get there, I think, and watch over the flock there. And we know, and this is very interesting to me, again, it's a scroller at the bottom, but we know that when they first met, and Joseph in his sleigh with Emma came up to the Whitney store, he basically says, "Newell K. Whitney, thou art the man." And Newell, of course, responded something to the fact of, well, you have the advantage of me because I have no idea who you are. And Joseph said, "I am Joseph the prophet. You have prayed me here. Now what do you want of me?" Nick, go into a little bit just briefly about maybe the Whitneys and what they had been searching for, Anne's background on religion or with religion, and maybe why this was important.
Well, they were people of some success, some established, character in their area. But they specifically were interested, as were a lot of people, in what we might call spiritual gifts or gifts of the Spirit. And I would say particularly on those that we might call the charismatic gifts of the Spirit. These would be the things that you can see from the outside, like the gift of tongues and things like that. And so she had read about these things in the scriptures, and she had come to understand that these were relevant parts of a converted soul, and she wanted to take part of it, and yet she hadn't been able to find those aspects, and they come into play in a kind of a long-term way, because they continue to hold stores or build stores in the various places where the saints move, and continue to play a part in the restoration in many other ways. But I think it originally started essentially with people that were deeply engaged in trying to find what they saw as the ancient church and these spiritual gifts. And it was through their prayers that essentially brought them Joseph and an introduction to the gospel.
Yes, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And we know that, as it mentions here, that Joseph had actually seen Newell and Anne in vision. And so he knew who he was looking for when he first showed up at the store. And again, not a man of coincidence. This was something that the prophet had seen in vision, and he knew he had to gather to the Ohio and do what the Lord had requested. So
yeah. Well, and he ended up becoming Joseph's landlord.
Exactly. For multiple weeks, right? If
That's right.
not longer, several weeks. And we know
Yeah.
the School of the Prophets was held there in an upper room, and some different fun things had occurred there. So, and we'll get into that, I'm sure, in future chapters. But with that, Nick, I'm going to ask you, because I think that kind of closes down chapter 10. Do you want to jump into chapter 11 and maybe just go over some of the highlights that you see just from a summary perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. Before I do that, though, I do hope that people are taking the time to read the D&C along with Saints, because I think it will help contextualize a lot of what we read and put some meat on the bones, so to speak. It'll give the Revelation something a little bit more human than maybe we may have considered it in the past. But I also want to put in a plug for the Revelations in Context essays that the church has put out on history.lds.org, because there's a section by section essay essentially where they give a cultural background, a context for each of the sections. And I'm actually going to be referring to a couple of those, because there's some really cool stories that come from those essays that I think will help the saints volume have even more meaning. But as you said, let's get on to chapter 11, not bankruptcy, but of saints. And so here we go. Joseph and Emma, as we said, lived with the Whitneys in Kirtland when they first arrived. Joseph, he was really interested in visiting all the new converts and was kind of anxious by their anxious experience to have these spiritual gifts, these charismatic gifts where people were, I think in one case it was described as someone was bouncing off the walls like a baboon, and thinking that somehow had a connection to spiritual gifts. So there were revelations that came out at this time about those gifts of the Spirit. This chapter also goes into Oliver Cowdery and Parley Pratt's endeavor to teach the gospel to the Delaware Indians. I had no idea that's where the name Delaware came from until this. So there's Delaware Indians, but they're in Missouri, ironically. This is where I learned essentially this name that I'm glad I listened to the Saints version on audiobook so I'd know how to pronounce Kick-the-Weenan, which is the Kick-the-Weenan is the name of the Delaware Indians tribal leader. And he, the Parley Pratt and Oliver Cowdery have many encounters with the Delaware Indians as a way for the saints to have some part in fulfilling Book of Mormon prophecy, if you will, having this gospel brought to the descendants of the Lehites as they've been spread throughout many nations and many lands. And this was one of the early attempts to bring the Book of Mormon to these indigenous people. And so there's some interesting stories there that we can get into, but there's also this particular instance with Kick-the-Weenan, which I don't even know what that name means, but that is one of the first introductions to polygamy, because the American Indians actually practiced polygamy. And in this particular case, some of Kick-the-Weenan's wives were actually who served Oliver and Parley dinner.
Sure.
So this became another way in which polygamy was something that was introduced in the narrative, as well as later on we see that as Joseph and Sidney were going through their Bible translation, they kind of wondered, hey, this was practiced back in the ancient times. Why did God not rebuke them for it? Because at the time it was very looked down upon. It was not something that was commonly practiced. And so this kind of became that catalyst for a discussion or learning about the practice of polygamy. But as this section is called, as this chapter is called, having to do with establishing the law, that's a curious term. I'm curious, John, what you think what it means when we talked before about how there would be a revelation where God would reveal his law unto the people. How do you interpret that?
You know, I really believe at this point, again, the more formal structure of the church is being established. They are called to the Ohio. And again, we know they have to be endowed from power from on high. And I think a lot of that law has to deal with the fact that, they need to be blessed. They need to receive the power from on high through the endowment, through the covenant path that is being created for them. And so as we talk about the law, I think a lot of the more formal pieces of the church are now being established and now coming together. So I think we saw the fledgling church. And again, don't get me wrong, the church is still fledgling here. It by no means is to the point where everything is put into place. Even now, I don't believe it is. I still think the gospel is being restored. Yes, yes. But I believe the law is being created so that there is some formal structure that people can have.
Yeah, and it's an interesting word or I guess an interesting concept, because there are so many times in the scriptures, in the saints, we're going to see this moving forward in the other chapters, that there is this revelation on the law. This is, something that is a term that's used, and we don't often use it the way that Joseph might have used it. And I think that's part of what I think is unique to Doctrine and Covenants scripture as it ties in with ancient scripture, because in ancient scripture in the Old Testament, what you would hear when you heard the law, they were talking about the law of Moses.
Sure.
That is not what we're talking about here per se. It is not the exact same thing, although there are some crossover points. But most people don't understand that when in section 38, the Lord revealed to Joseph that if they went to Ohio, he would bring them the law, that came to be in section 42 of the Doctrine and Covenants. So if you read the first 72 verses, I think, of section 42, and there's 93 total, but that is the law. That is what they were supposed to get when they came to Ohio. And in that, there's layers of different things that include the thou shalt not kills and the 10 commandments, but it also expounds on it. And it's where those things are expounded on that we as Latter-day Saints can find some definition in our beliefs. And in this particular case, I wanted to bring up this idea of the law as it connects to the early beginnings of the law of consecration, because the law of consecration is one of the things under the heading of the law. And this kind of echoes back in my mind, and I could be wrong, but it echoes back in my mind to the section of Matthew where Christ was asked, what are the greatest commandments in the law? And at this time, they were referring to the law of Moses, but his response is far more profound than just a practical advice. He is saying to love God and love your neighbor. Two things. If you look at the 10 commandments, the first 4 or 5 are about loving God. No, having no other God before you, don't use his name in vain, etc. And the next ones are how to love your neighbor. Don't steal from them. Don't cheat with their wives and so on. Don't kill them. That's an easy one. But we look at these things, and under the law, it really still comes down to loving God and loving our neighbor. So with that being said, the law of consecration is one part of that. It's one piece of it. And how we apply that law has changed over time, which laws are stable, sturdy, eternal. How we live those laws can change and does change. And so in this particular case, the law of consecration meant that they called a bishop, Edward Partridge in this case. And Edward Partridge was a good financier. He understood a lot of different things, but he was called to be the presiding bishop, what we might call today the presiding bishop. And it was his job to essentially oversee the implementation of the law of consecration, which in this time was deed your property over to the church. And from there, the bishop, Edward Partridge, would then grant you a stewardship over a part of that. And that's a very distinct word in the law of consecration, stewardship over ownership, because there's a lot of Americana behind owning things and land rights and things like that. So it's a different take than what we may have seen in the Morley Farm and things that were tried in the past with communal property. And contrary to popular belief, the law of consecration never went away. And Gordon B. Hinckley even has quoted that it never went away, but in the way that we practice it, it has changed. And for those that have gone to the temple and have taken a study up of section 42, you can see how that principle holds true, that it just essentially it's how we take what we have been blessed by the Lord and given back as part of our stewardship with those things that the Lord has blessed us. And again, that can be administered in different ways. In Edward Partridge's time, it had a lot to do with sharing and being communal, which was very important considering how many times they had to keep moving from place to place.
Exactly.
So anyway, that's my little rant on the law. I hopefully that doesn't take too much time. But one of the other things that I wanted to kind of ask you about and get your thoughts about that was we have some discussion in this last chapter and in this chapter of how things were going with the translation of the Bible. What's your understanding of the why that was even being done? What was the relevance of Joseph and Sidney engaging to do that? Do you have any insights or thoughts on the importance of biblical translation?
I'd love to hear your thoughts, because that's why I bring you on specifically, because you have studied this. But
Uh,
I know, obviously, if you just even take it at face value, which is our article of faith, uh, as far as it is translated correctly, and we know that Joseph never did finish the inspired translation of the Bible. And a question in my mind is, why hasn't that continued? Maybe past him, if that was an important thing that we should be undertaking, or should have been continued after his martyrdom. But we know we want the Bible in its purest format. We know that the King James version is the version that our leaders have felt is the most inspired and the closest to the original. But we know that through the years, scribes and scholars have dropped truths, either intentionally or unintentionally, from the original Bible. And that may have been through translation. It may have been because of some hidden motives. I'm sure it's all of the above to some extent. But yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts. We know that is an inspired piece of scripture. Obviously, it's in our standard works. But let me know. I'd love to know. You've obviously thought about this, so tell me more.
well, part of why it's on my mind, and this is maybe why it's come up in timing things, but the fourth volume of the Joseph Smith papers on translations and Revelation just came out. And as a result, the Church History Department and the Joseph Smith Papers Project had a conference 2 days ago on Friday. And a lot of what they were talking about was translation and how that relates to scriptural translation. Even today, they had people from the church's various departments that are in charge of translations for the scriptures that are still happening in the various parts of the world. And they talked about this idea that translation has a lot of expectations, because some people will see on one side that it is a word for word translation, and there's no nuance to it. It is exactly the word is translated literally, which in some cases is kind of a Google Translate level of things, which sometimes, if you've ever played around with Google Translate, it's not very readable. Then on the other side, you've got a very loose version of translation, where it's really just kind of capturing the meaning of the text. And then you have some like sliding scale in between. And so when they're talking about this idea of language and translation, and when Joseph Smith is trying to translate the Bible, he's obviously taking it from an English version and kind of reinterpreting it. He's not taking it from Greek or Hebrew and retranslating it. So sometimes that can be confusing for some people when we talk about a biblical translation that Joseph was doing. It's maybe not translation in the way we use it today. You served your mission in Taiwan,
Exactly.
so you understand that doing translations of something is not just doing words for word, but you're transmitting meaning.
Exactly.
And so when we talk about Joseph and Sidney doing these things and Bible translations, a lot of that has to do with taking the original intent of the authors and so on. I guess part of the reason I bring this up is there's a New Testament coming out that's being published by Deseret Book and BYU. That's a modern day translation of the New Testament done from Greek by one of the BYU scholars. And I talked with him on my podcast recently about this, and it was really interesting to get his perspective on endeavoring to take an ancient text and make it modern, but also to be sensitive to an LDS interpretation on the text. And it's a very interesting process. It's quite amazing to think that Joseph Smith, with his lack of formal education,
Sure.
was able to get anywhere near this process. It's really pretty amazing.
Yeah, that's incredible and interesting. Very interesting.
So,
Well, that's good. That's good. Hey, as we
yes,
move right along here,
forgot about Lucy.
Yeah, let's talk about Lucy. This is a very, very interesting, I think, episode in church history.
Yes, and so for the sake of time, we can't go through all the details, of course, of everything that's gone on. But Lucy Mack Smith, of course, is the mother of Joseph Smith Jr., and she was called many times to lead people. Sometimes it was her own family, but in this case, it was a group of 80 people that were going from New York to Ohio, and they were traveling along. And as happens in the wintertime, the river started to freeze over, and it made it at that point impossible for them to pass. And so she was able to muster a good bit of gumption, we might say, in Old West. She had some gumption to rally the troops, to understand the necessity that they had of getting to Ohio. And I can't remember the exact quote. There was one where she basically commanded the river to part. I mean, it was very almost Moses-like. I'm trying to see if I can find the quote, but maybe you have it, John. Is there something about? It was right before this quote you have on the screen that the ice parted. She had some rather bold thing to state. Let me see. See if I can find it. Well, she just said, "Where is your faith? Where is your confidence in God?" She said to the people, "If you will all raise your desires to heaven, that the ice may be broken up and we be set at liberty, as sure as the Lord lives, it will be done." And it was from that in that moment, if you've ever heard a massive piece of ice breaking apart on a major lake or a river, it's quite like thunder, and it split open, and the river was essentially, the way was made that they were able to make their way to Ohio through the newly parted river, and it was largely due to her strength. I think her leadership was really shown forth in this example, and it's pretty fun.
Yes, very good. Yeah, so that again, Lucy Mack Smith leading 80 people and really just telling them to quit complaining. We see that a lot with some of the early saints, right? We will see that even more in future episodes. But just saying, hey, work together, guys. It's not this hard. Have faith in the Lord, and He'll make a way. And things did happen in a good way, and they were able to get where they needed to go. Well, shall we end with the episode of the twins? I've got that showing right now.
I think that's a fair way to end it. Joseph and Emma were not so lucky sometimes with childbirth. They lost a number of children throughout the years, and in this particular episode, this vignette, there was a story where Joseph and Emma were getting ready to have twins of their own, a boy and a girl. But they basically died at birth, and they were distraught. They were naturally, what a heartbreaking thing to have to go through. But the Murdochs were a couple that Julia and, what's his name?
Was it John?
John, yes. Julia and John Murdoch were nearby, and they had their own set of twins. But the mother, Julia, passed away after giving birth to them. And so when Joseph heard about her passing, he reached out to John and let them know that he and Emma were willing to raise the kids. It's kind of a bold thing to ask. I mean, nowadays we think that might sound a little off color to some,
right.
but this was a heartfelt, loving thing, and John was unable to care for those kids, and so he accepted the offer. And Joseph and Emma, essentially adopted those two. And when Mother Smith arrived from her iced over river trip, she was able to greet her, essentially her new grandbabies. So feels like a happy ending, even though there's kind of a bittersweet tragedy along the way.
Exactly. And we'll leave that bit of foreshadowing, I guess, for future weeks when we cover some of those chapters. But wonderful. Well, Nick, hey, it's been a great night. I'd love to give you the last word. Obviously, we'd love to thank our listeners and those who watch, but would love to kind of have you summarize chapters 10 and 11 in Saints and leave us with the final word. I'm giving you the floor, so they only see you.
Yeah, you shouldn't do that. That's now you're in trouble. Well, chapters 10 and 11, as are all the rest of the chapters that I have read so far in the Saints. Admittedly, I haven't finished the volume. They give us a look at the way that they experienced their own history, and in this particular case, we got to see the experience of the saints as they came to the various challenging life decisions that they had to make. I mean, I imagine giving up your land and continually trying to find new places of safety just to live your religion. It's quite a challenging prospect, but in every way that the saints were challenged, the Lord blessed them and supported them. And even when there was great tragedy, like what we just talked about with Joseph and Emma and them losing their children, that there was a way provided for them to still be parents and for them to be able to experience the gospel in a different way. And so there are so many different aspects that we can draw from this, but it really has to do with the fact that we see over and over in the Saints volume the many different ways that the hand of the Lord guides his people, and he is continually guiding the people today. And I'm blessed to see that history so that I can know that hasn't stopped. It's still going today.
Right. Absolutely. Well, thank you. What a fitting testimony at the end. And again, thank you for bringing your knowledge. You're definitely a gospel scholar. That's
you're very kind.
That's a title I would give to you. So thank you again for joining us. And everyone join us next week as we cover chapters 12 and 13 in Saints. Make sure you comment. Let us know again where you're watching from, and any other questions that you may have or comments, please comment below. Even after we're done going live, we'll try to answer those and answer any questions that you may have, or comment back to you based on what you leave for us in the comments below.
Yep.
So Nick, have a great week.
Yeah, you too.
Appreciate your time once again, and
Absolutely.
We'll see everyone next week.